This is called Locating the Human, the Needs and Purposes of Genome Editing. And I'm Chris Saha. I'm a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Biomedical Engineering. And I'm also one of the co-directors here with Ben and Sheila of the Global Observatory. Thank you so much again for coming and had a great start this morning. I love the energy in the room and we'll hope to continue that. So the kind of central goal, one of the central goals of the Global Observatory has been to expand the conversation and to hear from voices that perhaps some had not been given the same amount of platform as some of the other voices in summits and other policymaking movements. And so in that spirit, we had assembled a really distinguished panel and still have three fantastic speakers coming soon to follow. One note here is that Teresa Burke from Gaudet University has unfortunately tested positive recently and is feeling unwell. So we will wish her well and hope to include her perspective in a future meeting. We will, however, be fortunate to have three distinguished panelists here. Rachel Salzman from Alcyone Therapeutics and ASC, John Evans and Ben Hurlbut from Arizona State University. Just a few marks to kind of frame some of the discussion here is that there's many different ways of locating the human in these discussions. Just thinking back to the CRISPR babies affair of 2018 that's been referenced several times. You can find policymakers, press coverage of locating the human in the embryo that was edited, in the parents that were involved in the society in which those edited children would live, and as well as in the kind of academic freedom of the scientists who were seeking to do this type of work, as well as the affected patient community. And so there was a comment earlier this morning that this work has been shifting into the clinical space, and perhaps at least the discourse is trying to move it there. And I think it is an interesting way to locate the affected human in these debates. So we'll hear a number of different comments about how we kind of diversify and frame who the subject is, as well as the collective society in which we are thinking about this. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce first Rachel and give her the floor. She is the Executive Vice President at Portfolio and External Affairs and Development at Alcyone Therapeutics. She's also been a great colleague at the Forum on Regenerative Medicine at the National Academies with me, as well as on a number of important leadership committees at the American Society for Cell and Gene Therapy. And excited to hear your comments.
So do I need a microphone? Is this okay? Good morning, everybody, and I really wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to see people in person. It's really, really wonderful. I don't have slides, and there's a reason that I don't have slides. I give a lot of talks, but they're not for observatories. The talks that I give are more like, what's the problem, what's the solution, what are we going to do? And that's like a slide. Those are a bunch of slides, right? Here's what happened, here's the problem, here's some ways about addressing it. And I think the beauty of being in the observatory situation is we have, I'm going to say the luxury to really consider what the questions are and to really consider what perspectives we should be approaching. So my focus here is to kind of maybe talk more about what would have been my first slide, which is all about examination of what current state is, what our current ways of thinking about the problems and the challenges should be. And then someone just shared with me a quote from Einstein. This is kind of always an easy way to, you know, get a lot of, what do I want to say, a lot of encouragement in the meeting. This one, Einstein said, if we have an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes studying what the problem was and then 5 minutes working on the solution. So in that spirit, that's why I have no slides. I thought a lot about the problem. I want to make another comment. I love the graphic here. I didn't get a chance to really study it until late last night because it's a fence, right? And it's in search of limits. And the whole idea of fences to some of us are kind of not good things. But in other ways, if you have neighbors, it has to be a really good thing. So you have to think about who's on what side of the fence. And I think that's a lot of the conversations that we've been having lately. Who's being kept in, who's being kept out, what's the purpose of the fence? And of course, embedding the DNA strand, which is super clever. So I've never seen an image like this. And I just really want to give kudos to whoever designed it, because it really, to me, represents what this entire global observatory conversation is about. So just a few thoughts about, you know, what I've been asked to comment on. We're talking about the role of genome editing in society, and specifically in terms of what are the benefits, you know, in humans, we're talking about in humans. I'm a veterinarian by training, that's why it actually matters in humans. So what are the benefits, what are the potential downsides, and what are the uncertainties? And back to me commenting that I'm trained as a veterinarian, I'm really wanting to consider these issues through the lens of, I think the way we always approach everything is through our own life experiences and observations and learnings. I started out like on the ultimate, like one-on-one situation. You know, it was me and a horse, and, you know, I was a large animal doctor, needed to be able to, you know, address the situation at hand. Then my family encountered a rare monogenic disorder, probably one that some of the panelists are already familiar with. And then I transitioned over years to becoming an advocate for that rare disease. And because it was monogenic, got very involved in innovative gene therapy. And in fact, we were behind the very first clinical use of lentivirus in the clinic, which, as you all know, is HIV, started 20 years ago. And at the time, got a lot of pushback. You can't put lentivirus in people, even if it's ex vivo. Went to very important meetings where half the people were like, that's a great idea. And the other half the people were like, you know, you're crazy. So when you become an advocate in a situation like that, you also enter the world of innovation. Even though I came from a very personal perspective, the whole idea of bringing a new innovation, even to a small patient group, brings with it huge societal implications that go well beyond that individual patient, that individual disease, and even that individual community. And then from there, I kind of evolved my own professional life from being a solo practitioner into becoming part of these much larger organizations. As Chris kindly mentioned, I'm very involved in the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, where, again, we think very much about who our customer is. At the end of the day, our customer is the patient, even though very few patients belong to the society, but that's what the goal is. And of course, individual patients and family members, that's who makes up society. So that's kind of our lens for approaching our guiding principles for how we think about doing what we're doing and messaging what we're doing. And then from there, I evolved into industry, because what I also learned, like everything else the hard way, is public forums, public funding, public resources are essential at certain stage of the life cycle of an idea, an innovation, and technology. However, in order to be able to scale things and make them accessible to all members of society, and I think, again, that's offenses, and I do mean all members without respect to borders or other kinds of limit or resources or marginalized populations. you need to have the private sector involved. So now I actually do work in the biotech industry, and the conversations there are very different because we think about resources differently. We have different competing forces. And at the end of the day, there does need to be some alignment, but there's never going to be complete alignment. But that's why we're in the observatory. So that's kind of my own journey that I wanted to share with you, from something very specific to something very, very big. And along that way, I've done a lot of work in government relations, and have been involved in regulatory and policy conversations all along the line of, genomic medicine, gene therapy, cell therapy, gene editing, et cetera. In terms of when we think about what are the benefits, downsides, and uncertainties of genome editing, what do they bring? We should really think about small to large, or individual to full society. So the benefits are sort of obvious. If you have a sick nephew or 3 sick nephews like I did, I get the benefit. In this case, with gene therapy, it can actually, potentially cure a disease. But then, of course, as I mentioned, once you innovate and bring a technology to a larger population, the benefits can be manifested not just across larger groups of patients, but larger disease groups and their families and their workplaces and their societies. So you go from helping one child, suddenly the family is more functional, suddenly their businesses are more functional, suddenly the whole community is much more functional. So I think the benefits range anywhere from, a child has a life to like a community now has vibrancy and resources coming in and is functional and sustainable. In terms of the potential downsides, I would say I think about those opposite, maybe from large to small, right? So the downsides of genome editing is, of course, we don't know yet everything about it. We don't know close to everything about it and how it's going to manifest and the kind of concerns that it might bring. So that means that there's some threats that are even hard to articulate, but they're big, right? Because we're talking about the human genome. You can't really sense everything in this way. It's just not a realistic way to do science. We talked a little bit about that there just can't be borders, especially in certain environments. So in that case, the downsides, when you have an adverse event and there's a death, or this story with the Chinese investigator and he ends up going to jail, that has reverberations across all of society, and I would say, globally. And what you need to think about, okay, somebody reading about it at home in the newspaper, they're like, that's this crazy thing that happened that this rogue scientist did, and he went to jail, and whoopee, and that's great, but now there's bigger issues and people don't know what they're doing. That trickles down to on a very individual level, where you have, a family or patient community faced with a problem that's pathological in nature, that's genomic in nature, that gene editing is starting to think about doing. And when they think about that, this is a disease that's been inherited in the family across many generations, as it turned out, we didn't realize this was in my own family and many other families. There's a potential, when you talk about heritable genome editing, to actually, stop it. So there's actually, when you think about the downside, stopping something kind of comes with the downside of stopping something, even though there might have been some adverse events. And then in terms of the uncertainties, I think that's very much an evolving conversation. All I can say is that what I'm uncertain about today is literally different than what I was uncertain about a week ago. And I think we just need to be mindful of what those uncertainties are and realize the list is infinite. And as we move from the right column to the left column, we just need to be mindful to continue to populate the column and triage everything so that we understand what do we not know and what do we care about more that we don't know versus less than we don't know. The other comment I wanted to make of what genome editing brings to humans is something that is the opposite of language. It's what's unspoken. I think there have been unspoken promises about this technology made to individuals, to groups, and to society. And I think it's hard for us to hear what we're not saying, even though it is being heard. And what I mean by that is, by virtue of sharing scientific advancements and maybe talking about ideas that are being manifested then in mice or in tissue culture, there's unspoken promises about what that's going to bring for, relief of human suffering. So I would sort of argue that one big aspect of language this observatory should be mindful of is all the words that are not being spoken, but that are being implied. We wake up every day with certain assumptions about what science is bringing us and not bringing us, and what's dangerous about it, and what's not dangerous. And it's not because someone specifically articulated it, but more so the gestalt of everything that's coming our way. So that's sort of my view in terms of what it's bringing to us. What values are at stake? Okay, back to language. That's why I love this first panel, like, whose values, right? So before you say what values are at stake, I would just sort of argue whose values in terms of when it comes to applying genome editing. And again, I think that values are a little bit like politics. They can be local and they can be more relevant depending on what your circumstances are. And in this case, back to this continuum of me having the luxury of speaking without providing answers at this observatory, I would argue that values range from existential to theoretical. We don't all have the luxury of having theoretical values when we're in a more existential situation, and that changes what our values are. So the perfect example of this might be when you're dealing with risk benefit of something like genome editing, and you appreciate there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of uncertainties, but if there's a disease that you're trying to address in someone who you care about or a community that you know of, suddenly your values about how you're going to gauge those risks become very different, as opposed to someone, I don't want to say who has the luxury to be more existential, I would say has the responsibility to be more existential. So again, this observatory, in terms of how we think about values, we need to really think about what the range of those values are and whose values those actually could be. And I would also say that for a given community, element of society or family or individual, values can evolve even over the course of a relatively short amount of time based on existential circumstances. And then the another question was, how do those who are responsible set limits, adjudicate, or reconcile some of what genome editing can bring to us, and how they can set limits and adjudicate across disparate values and interests. So back to that word responsible. I don't know who's responsible, and I think that merits a really, really important conversation, because I think that paternalism is something that the world still struggles with. And I think that it's really incumbent on this global observatory to think about responsibility is a very, very important word, and it carries with it a lot of power. So I would also encourage us to think about what the burden of responsibility really, truly means. In terms of setting limits, adjudicating and reconciling disparate values and interests, of course, I talked about before that, of course, there's disparate values and interests. And again, we need to think about they evolve from small to large and large to small, depending on what a particular group's circumstances are, or concerns are, or a legislative body or policy body or regulatory bodies. Their disparate views on a given situation really can be different. I think the other important key takeaway for me, being in this area for 20 years, is how incredibly rapidly everything is evolving. And I'm not saying anything new, that science kind of outpaces our sense of who we are as a humans or who we are as a society, and that's why we have these kind of conversations. So I absolutely do not have any answers about how to adjudicate disparate values and interests when it comes to genome editing, but I would first say, let's sort of examine what does it even mean to be responsible and who is responsible. The last comment I want to make, because I really do benefit from these personally, from the interactive nature of these meetings, and that's why I'm really happy to be here, is the themes that have come my way that I believe these are the forces at play that the Global Observatory should be mindful that we need to contend with, now, tomorrow, and the day after, because they're going to happen no matter what our opinion is. I think that there's always, I know this is why I get paid. We do a lot of innovation at my biotech, right? And some of it, I'm not now speaking on behalf of my company, obviously, but innovation in gene editing and gene therapy, some of it is what I would call guided and some of it is unguided. And by that, I mean, We always are wanting to invest in discovery for its own sake, and there's many people who work in science just for its own sake. So we don't really know where that innovation is going. That means you just need to be a little bit more thoughtful as it evolves. Where is it going to go? And it is traveling in a universe that's independent of people who are claiming or calling out the need for responsibility. It's never going to stop. It shouldn't stop. We just need to be mindful that it's there. Another theme that's kind of been, I don't know, kind of through osmosis that I've really started to live my life through more is risk benefit, right? Everything we do has to do with risk and benefit. I think if it wasn't COVID that taught us this, nothing will ever teach us this. And those are decisions that need to be made, interestingly, just on an individual level, but also on a societal level, and something where you need to be really respectful of where does my view of risk benefit give me the autonomous power to act on those values, as opposed to where does my view, and by me, I don't mean an individual, it could be a group, it could be a collective, it could be, you know, the cosmopolitans or other kind of way of kind of bisecting who we all are. How does that risk benefit potentially impact other groups? So suddenly you're bleeding over into another area. So risk benefit is something that genome editing, to me, that is all day long, we need to be mindful of that. The other point I wanted to make, which I think we're being more appreciative of, is the importance of access and equity. So we need to remember that all of these conversations and all of this innovation and all of this intersection of policy and science and technology, we need to remember, we need to think about who's going to be able to access this, and is it going to be equitable, and is it relevant? And I think another point was made earlier is, yeah, if people are worried about putting food on their table, absolutely, that should be their first priority. But we're all super hopeful, optimistic at heart. That's how we get through life, all of us. So I do think that most people are even struggling on a more fundamental basis are expecting things to get better. And that's why we always do need to be mindful of the message that when your bandwidth widens, so does your view of the world need to widen in parallel to that. And what goes corresponding with that, which I've been able to also experience, is advocacy. Advocacy is so important, and it's the one place where literally one person can make a massive difference. Just going to give you, I'm sure that a lot of these genome editing policies that you've all interacted with got tweaked because one person, for very good reasons, had a certain viewpoint and was able to get other people to understand them. So I think advocacy, which usually is being brought forward with some sort of agenda, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's good to have an agenda because then you have a lot of people with different agendas advocating, amongst and against and with each other. The importance of advocacy is critical, and I would call on the observatory to be mindful of who are the advocates here and what are their agendas, because of course there's not perfect alignment, nor should there be, but of course we need to recognize who's doing what and why, and not underestimate the power of the advocate. And then I think the final comment I want to make is about, and I'm really getting this more because of my COVID experience, our COVID experience, and that's trust. There's no sense in coming up with a lot of great science and ideas and policies if the audience just does not have a fundamental trust in the messenger and or the message. And that had to do with an earlier comment about how we're still struggling with engagement. And I think that has been at the source of literally a lot of deaths. I mean, people died of COVID unnecessarily because there was inadequate engagement across multiple levels. And maybe in genome editing, some people are not going to be saved or diseases won't be prevented because we're not activating and being mindful of the proper tools of engagement. And for me, really what that comes down to, and I've thought about this a lot, is part of the solution to engagement is entering the room with humility, with a desire to educate, and also with a real need to commit to respect all the way around. And to me, those are the pathways and the guiding principles for how we should think about all of the challenges and opportunities that we're facing. So then I'm going to stop. And thank you so much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Next, we have Professor John Evans from the University of California, San Diego. John is a Chancellor Chair in Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology, and Associate Dean. And plus, he authored a recent book called The Human Gene Editing Debate.
Thanks, Chris. I apologize ahead of time. I've learned some very bad habits from anthropologists. I over-prepared for talks, used to try to get over these things, and then decided I'm just going to run with it to the end of my career. So, the conference here is about limits, panels about purposes, and I want to meld these two by talking about what limits experts could suggest for the purposes of gene editing. I talk pretty loud. I'm loud. So, yeah.
Yes,
So
maybe just
use this guy instead.
It's often.
How's that? Reminds me of a joke. I was at a conference where there's a philosopher who was proposing to redesign the entire human species genetically, but he couldn't get his PowerPoint to work. And the joke was, "Are we sure we want this guy? We can't get PowerPoint to work to redesign the human species." Can you hear me through the microphone? Okay. So, I want to be something very specific by the term "could suggest limits." We could suggest anything. And I do not mean by this what's morally proper. What I mean is could suggest limits that are sociologically possible. And I'd like to call a moratorium on suggesting limits that are sociologically impossible to hold. To anticipate where I'm going with this and to slightly overstate the case, for example, limit the purpose of healing disease is sociologically impossible, whereas other limits, such as the somatic germline boundary, are at least conceivably possible. So, believe it or not, I'm going to do this in 15 to 20 minutes. And when you see orange, if you doze off, that's where I am. So, all bioethical debates about technologies that are still developing have this structure. A slippery slope argument starts with its metaphorical slope with the most meritorious action at the top. The bottom is the action that is maximally objectionable from the view of the top. If we step onto the top, by selecting A, then it's more likely in the future that we'll select the currently unjustifiable option of B. Arriving at B, we're then more likely to select an even less desirable option of C. The morally worthy decision at the top changes the social context of the next decision, making the undesirable choice below more likely. Eventually, we're at the bottom of the slope where we do not want to be when we took the first step. So the classic argument here is that if we accept doctor-assisted suicide for terminally ill people, then it increases the odds that we will slide to C, which is something like, forced euthanasia of some sort. Now, the best way to understand the limits here is this sociological version of the slippery slope metaphor. The philosophical version, where A has to lead to B, is considered to be very bad reasoning. The sociological version here is actually how all culture changes, and it's just a little hard to predict ahead of time. So this is how the gene modification debate crystallized in the early 70s and has persisted to this day. There's a very high consensus that the top of the slope is somatic gene therapy, such as changing the genes in existing humans to heal something like sickle cell disease. The vast majority of people stepped onto the slope at A in the 70s, both because of the moral value of healing existing live humans with terrible diseases, and because they thought the barriers below would stop any slide down the slope. And I'm going to talk more about barriers in a minute. The first debate of the 50s and 60s involved eugenicists who wanted to perfect the human species, and after they lost the debate, their position became the forbidden position at the bottom of the slope at C, but all other positions on the slope were virtuous in relationship to. So what's at the bottom? There's two versions of this. Conservatives and older people see the bottom as the brave new world because design is thought to treat humans like objects and is beyond the role of humans. Liberals tend to think the design of humanity could result in genetically structured social inequality, which is the movie Gattaca, a movie about a future where genetic control of children is nearly universal. To understand why the slope would slip towards Gattaca or the brave new world, we have to discuss the terrain on the slope that can be slippery. The terrain is defined by what is morally relevant about the act on the slope. So in the genetic engineering debate, the terrain is a combination of target and trait. By target, I mean person or species. Trait is what the gene leads to in a body. Tay-Sachs disease is at the top. Genetic traits for intelligence, whatever that is at the bottom. Point is that the terrain of the slope is combinations of traits and targets ordered from the most acceptable to modify to the least acceptable. So how does a debate slip one unit down the slope? That is, how are limits that we could come up with for a particular purpose of gene editing, how are those approached? So small steps down slippery slopes are more likely in the absence of a sharp line between cases. But the cases aligned as gradient or continuum, but the arguments or policies are connected by a series of small steps. There are two features that encourage slipperiness along the terrain of the slope. One is continuity vagueness, where the terrain is a continuous measure. People invoke the Warnock report. That's a classic example. 14, why not 13? Why not 15? Why not 16? Okay. Age of driving in the United States is a classic. Another one, like, well, it's 16 where I grew up, but it's, why not 14? Why not 15, etc. The second quality of the terrain, which I'll talk more about, is similarity vagueness, where measurement is not possible, is irrelevant, or when it depends on imprecise components. Think of the example of night in the English language. It refers to a huge range of objects with different purposes. So to foreshadow similarity vagueness and get you thinking about this, I'd like everyone to think of the word disease. And I'll get back to that later on. So the question is, slippery down the slope depends on similarity between 2 points. But you have to ask similar by what standard? So if I had the fountain pens of Barack Obama and Thomas Jefferson on my desk, they're really similar if the standard is effectiveness of putting ink to paper. If the standard is age, they're utterly dissimilar. So we have to ask, what's the standard I'm measuring this by? And in ethics, it's moral values. 2 adjacent points on the slope here can be made the same if the terrain is slippery, if they're justified using the same moral value. For example, using gene editing to stop someone being born with sickle cell anemia or adult onset heart disease can be made the same if both are justified by the value of beneficence. So, final piece of my theoretical setting here is barriers on the slippery slope. The entire ethical debate is about these barriers and whether bad impacts happen depend on whether barriers will hold. We could also call these barriers limits. Here are some philosophers agreeing with my depiction of the debate. John Harris, who would otherwise not want to be quoted with me, says slopes are only slippery if they catch us unaware, we straight onto them and equipped. Main impact. Equipment here is drawing the line. So I'm going to conceptualize these limits as barriers on the slope that stop slipping. So, final question is then, what makes a strong barrier? What makes a strong limit that can sociologically hold if it's proposed? A strong barrier is a description of the difference between 2 contiguous steps on the slope that cannot be made similar through similarity or continuity vagueness. So I'm all the way to there, so I will unfortunately be slowing down. I want to give an example of a sociologically impossible and a sociologically fairly strong barrier before pointing to another possibilities that people have come up with in the existing debate. So let's use the somatic germline barrier as an example. This results in a slope that looks more or less like this. At the bottom is germline, the goals of the eugenicists that everyone was trying to distance themselves from in the 60s and 70s. If this is the only barrier, then everything upslope is allowed, everything downslope is not. this is the barrier that exists in continental Europe right now, roughly. Germline is the limit. So I got this fancy, I learned animation the other day, so I kind of fell in love with this. There are values that make sections of the terrain the same. Above the barrier in that acceptable area is justified by beneficence and non-maleficence. These means doing good, avoiding bad. It was beneficent because the goal was about existing people, and it was not scientifically conceivable how this could be applied to anything that was not a disease. It advanced non-maleficence because any mistake someone would make was somatic, would die with the modified person and couldn't be passed on to others. The values below the barrier were the inverse of all the bad values that the eugenicists were accused of having. The eugenicists were accused of supporting hubris, authoritarian views of imposing their vision of humanity on everyone else, violating nature, violating God's law, etc. So the proponents of the germline barrier supported the inverse of all of these: non-authoritarianism, humility, following nature's wisdom, and so on. If those values are defined in the terrain on the slope, then 1 inch above and 1 inch below the barrier cannot be made the same. What's on the two sides of the barrier? Upslope is modifying an individual existing human. Downslope is modifying the species. Doing the act downslope would violate those values. So how can you make these two acts the same through similarity vagueness, which is what is required to bring down that barrier? Well, first, the terrain is not slippery at all, making this much stronger. I would argue that individual and species cannot be made similar. They're like opposing concepts, at least in English. The individual you could actually meet. The species is an abstraction. The individual is in the present. The species is in the future. This coincides with lots of other concepts in Western culture. For example, removing a disease in the individual is the role God assigned to humans versus redesigning the species, which is what should be reserved for God. I can go on with this, and I do in that book that was referred to at the beginning. Upslope is typically called medicine. Downslope is something else. What is required for both is both for the terrain to be slippery and for acts on both sides of the barrier to be justified by the same moral value. For example, in the 90s, there was an attempt to take down this barrier by just asserting that beneficence and non-maleficence covered both sides, and thus there was perfect similarity on both sides. And so as a teaser for the book, and I make 99 cents for every one of these I sell, I'll simply say that the barrier was weakened significantly, largely because a baby was found on both sides of the wall. Now people care about modifying a baby, but not the species, whereas the eugenicists didn't care about babies unless they were influencing the species. So 1995 will answer that riddle for you, or certainly come talk to me at lunch if anyone cares. Look, I'm all the way down to near the bottom here. Let me consider the barrier at enhancement. The disease enhancement barrier worked great until the 1970s, and then became hopelessly subject to similarity and continuity vagueness. Originally, this terrain was not slippery at all. Let's start with the technological developments that have made the terrain 1 inch above and 1 inch below the barrier hopelessly vague and slippery. In the 70s, before genetic testing, before the Human Genome Project, before epigenetics, etc., number one there is genetic disease had to be observed in a family tree and had to be severe enough to distinguish from normal human variation. It had to be obvious in children. So you had sickle cell disease or you didn't. The enhancements were things on the high end of normal human variation. Intelligence, again, whatever that is. Number two, making the barrier strong was that diseases were the result of single genes and thus conceivable to change, whereas enhancements were and still are polygenic and thus unimaginable how you would do it. It was impossible to make sickle cell and intelligence traits the same. Thus the barrier was strong. Another way to think of this is that barrier was actually like so thick, it would have covered half of my chart here. But in the developments of the 90s, we see disease states not thought of as genetic diseases, but propensities towards normal human variation towards disease. Is propensity to develop a disease in your 60s a disease trait or normal human variation? Would lowering the odds of someone developing cancer from 10% to 5% be treating a disease or giving them an enhancement? How about resistance to viral disease, which is what Jean-Louis thought he was doing? It's essentially a disease-resisting enhancement. The fact that I'm stringing those words together shows you how hopelessly muddled this terrain has become. What's worse is that all of the far down the slope enhancement traits are continuous distributions with the left tail of what is typically considered to be a disease on the disease side of the barrier. So to use the one for which there's like 8 linear feet of philosophy journal articles written about, is a male being 4'7" a disease and a male 4'8" normal? Okay, is 4'9", et cetera, et cetera. It's this classic violation of the continuity problem. Intellectual disability is on one side, super intelligence is on the other. Where would you draw the line? An IQ of 70, 70, 71, 72, et cetera. The terrain for enhancements is particularly slippery, I guess that'd be the British version of this, slippery. And so you can't put it in place here. Moreover, the value changes over time create even more vagueness. Most notably, autonomy as a value is spread to cover both sides of the barrier. Who gets to define what a disease is? In the 50s, it would have been doctors. Okay? The very invention of bioethics was designed to take some of that power away from doctors. How is the individual, now it's the individual with the trait. Is deafness a disease that should be repaired? My boss at the university is deaf. She considers herself not to have a disease. She considers herself to be part of a unique American culture. People with the trait will differ in their opinion. Individuals will get to decide what a disease is, at least for cases that are close to the existing barrier. This is particularly true because starting in the 1980s, these technologies become part of the discourse about human reproduction. And in the US, at least, become part of reproductive freedom. Who will get to decide what the disease is? It will be the people involved. I'm actually at the bottom. So let me talk about some other commonly invoked limits or barriers. Safety. You could build a barrier to safety using the value of non-maleficence, which is one of the main complaints about, for example, what He-Jiankui did. This barrier, the only thing that would stop us is that if genetic modification is not safe. So problem is that putting your barrier at the limits of safety is that it just moves down the slope as your skill improves. If your only standard is safety, if germline becomes safe as somatic, then germline is as safe as you create this sliding barrier here. So I don't really think of these as barriers, it's more like speed bumps. Okay, they kind of move as you go down the hill. So this is the only barrier in place between germline prevents sickle cell and germline for athletic endurance. There is no boundary being drawn if it's all about safety. Let me go through. Oh. Click again for my fancy dancy. All those things I've skipped. All right, so let's talk about biological reality. This is another thing that I'm tempted to rely upon, which is the argument is that we don't have to worry about barriers because scientific reality, the nature of the human, will stop us from doing these terrible things. It will always be impossible, we could say, to genetically modify 200 genes simultaneously. So that can be our limit. Well, the problem is that the history of science shows it's a loser move to bet against human ingenuity. The impossible has a habit of becoming the possible. My favorite quote here from Arnold Matulsky from the Second American Government Bioethics Commission, who basically said he didn't want to talk about germline modification because this has happened for 300 years. He was, you know, the way you look at one way, he's 240 years off. I don't like the idea of the knowledge barrier. So this will just be a sort of rapid review. And after Francois' talk, I realized that embarrassingly, I did not include consensus in here. And I'm not sure how I could place this on the slope, but we could put consensus could be a barrier on the slope. But people have proposed severe disease that is beyond unstable and can either be placed on the slope because severe and disease are subject to extreme similarity vagueness. Some have proposed a professional domain account where the medical profession finds what a disease is. Well, the current medical profession also engages in human enhancement, And so it'd be very hard to have that be your limit. Way down near the bottom would be bioethics liberalism, which is you can only engage in modifications that maximize autonomy, beneficence, and non-maleficence. The problem is, I think those terms are really slippery as well. You know, for harm, for example, does it harm your kid if the other kids in the school are modified? I would argue it does. It's not just about an individual. I identify a barrier at most prevalent variant. Again, 1995 will get you an answer to that one. And finally, there is a nice solid one at the boundary of humanity, okay? Which would be, it is not slippery to say you can install any gene variant that has ever existed in any human ever, okay? It's very clear what that is, okay? And would exclude taking gene variants from animals, plants, and fully synthesize things. That's not slippery at all. The problem is that's near most people's bottom of the slope, okay? And so most people want their barrier to be somewhat above that. So I'll finish by saying ethics is about limits, as was said. Let's propose limits that are strong enough to survive by the time our technological ability reaches the barrier. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And finally, we have Hurlbut, who's a professor at Arizona State University and a co-conspirator of this.
So thanks a lot, Chris. And so I'm pinch hitting for Teresa Burke, who, as Chris said, unfortunately is ill and therefore couldn't join us. So I've thrown together some very hastily prepared remarks just a few minutes before this panel. And, you know, it will be a very inadequate attempt at giving at least a little taste of maybe some of the things that Teresa would have talked about. I think she would have talked about conceptions of disability and disorder, problematizing those conceptions or complexifying those conceptions. And I think also the sort of imaginations of virtue that authorize and empower those who would, you know, heal the disorders of the world. So what I want to do is offer a few little illustrations of some of that complexity. Really, in a sense, this is a footnote to some of the things that John just said, and really actually that Rachel said. So, but let me start by just sort of putting a couple of, by expanding the question of the human that is at the back of this panel. And it seems to me there are sort of, you know, to oversimplify, three sort of ways we can think about the human. And this is the common way of thinking about the human in these contexts, the meanings of projects in science and technology for human life. So the impacts on the human, the consequences of the human, the transformation of the human as object and site of intervention. But of course, at stake in those projects, where should I be pointing this? At stake in those projects and in the debates that happen around them is the human as concept, the idea of the human that is back of, that is contested around, and that ultimately authorizes those projects. So at stake in that concept of the human are imaginations of progress and the good, the forms of projects that are appropriate to the human. And let's note that the human in a sort of conceptual form and not merely a material form is undergoing transformation in the context of these sorts of debates. You might even say much more profound transformation than in the material domain, at least potentially, and at least initially. But the sort of third level, which in a sense was the focus of this morning's, why is this? How can I not operate this properly? That was, you know, in a sense what we were discussing with the first panel, is this, ways of being human together. The human is the political animal. Those modes of human life, human existence, of political coexistence, you know, in which we engage in forms of moral imagination, judgment, and delegation of decisional authority of moral imagination and judgment, and defer to those to whom we have delegated those questions. And it seems to me that the human is very profoundly, all three of these humans are very profoundly at stake in all of what we're talking about, though the focus tends to be on the first one, the human as a sort of material site of technological intervention. So I want to use this case, both its genesis and the reactions to it, to talk through some of these issues. And one of the strongest and most enduring reactions to the Chinese experiment was this criticism that it was improper, that it was unauthorized because it was medically unnecessary. And this is a version of that boundary, the sort of medicine enhancement boundary that John was just talking about. And here, this is from, sorry for the small text, this is from the 2017 National Academy's report, in which one of their sort of principles is restriction to preventing a serious disease or condition. So here is a limit being drawn, relying on a kind of presumed definition. So definition is limits. It's a finis, it's a fence, it's a boundary, and the boundary is given in the nature of things. That the seriousness of the disease or the condition sort of speaks itself, and from that, all else follows. And therefore, it's a kind of natural or naturalized limit. But what is the serious disease or condition? And who makes that judgment call anyway? This is a letter written by one of the couples that participated in his experiment to the court, the criminal court that was prosecuting him. And it was written in his defense and against the allegation that he had coerced his, subjects into participation. It's written against the backdrop of, what it means to be HIV positive in the society of which they are part, which Pete made reference to earlier. It's not merely the biological presence of the virus in the body, but the meanings associated with the presence of that virus in the body. If that presence is found out, if that becomes publicly known, one may find the need, in fact, people often do find the need to simply abandon their lives, relocate somewhere else, change their names, start over from scratch, etc., because of the significance that's attributed to being in that biological condition. That's a pretty serious disease or condition, right? And so here is an intervention undertaken in the name of responding to that condition. And the people who participated in the project are describing their participation as the key bit here is it's not that it was medically unnecessary, because we're fully aware that there's a way to have a healthy child that's not affected by HIV. But at a certain level, our participation in the experiment was indeed forced. We weren't coerced by any person in particular, namely the leader of the experiment. We were coerced by society. I think that this is a valuable illustration of the profound ambiguity associated with the presumptively natural and given and self-evident and given advance, serious condition, as though the medical sort of speaks for itself. And indeed, that National Academy's report actually interestingly acknowledges this, buried deep in the text of the report. It qualifies its own apparatus of delimitation by noting that it is profoundly ambiguous. Note that such concepts as reasonable alternatives and serious disease or condition embedded in these criteria are necessarily vague. Different societies will interpret these concepts in the context of their diverse historical, cultural, and social characteristics, taking into account input from their publics and their relevant regulatory authorities. So one thing to note here is the kind of disjunction in the text itself between a kind of naturalized limit, a limit that is the source of its own authority, and the acknowledgement of a kind of interpretive, of ambiguity and of an interpretive remit. But then furthermore, the kind of discarding of that interpretive responsibility or remit to the sort of local jurisdiction, which, if one approaches this from the perspective of scientific self-regulation, is in effect the PI of a laboratory, which is precisely how this played out, of course. So I think that's one thing to note, but the other is the heavy work that gets done by that sort of naturalized limit, the ways in which it invites us to stop thinking, and to therefore not ask questions about what sort of interpretive practices would go into this, and also the context and the forms of authority and empowerment that would be back of those interpretive practices, the where and by whom and on what basis and with what legitimacy and with what authority, which is in a sense what the conversation this morning was about. Those seem to me the fundamental questions, which of course are fundamental questions about not just, how to govern genome editing, but about being human together, right? Where the human, material, conceptual, and political are all simultaneously at stake. It also points, though, to the ways in which the circumstances of life don't, in a sense, answer the question, and instead invites us to look past them to the kind of imaginations of virtue that are animated. Okay, and I think that again the Chinese story is interesting in this regard, and so I'll tell you a little story about that Chinese story. So sometime before the project began, He was at a meeting, a scientific meeting where James Watson was also present, and this sort of towering figure in the history of molecular biology, He goes up to him and asks him a couple of questions. When you discovered the structure of DNA, did you think one day we would modify DNA? Watson has a thick accent. Watson has bad hearing. Watson asked him to write it down. So He wrote it down. Watson writes yes. Then he asks a second question. Well, do you think that, in effect, that's a good thing to do? That modifying the human genome, not just to treat disease, but to prevent disease is a good thing to do. And this is what Watson answers: make people better. So this paper ended up on the wall in the He laboratory as this project was undertaken. And I think it was taken in that laboratory the way that Watson intended it, as a kind of an authorization, right? But I mean, the ways in which there is a kind of occlusion of ambiguity combined with an extraordinary hubris in this phrase strikes me as worth meditating on. The making, the power to make, the authorization to undertake that technological project, and the presumption that those who wield that power also are in a position to make judgments about better, right? And after all, better is intrinsically virtuous if you're thinking of it in the sense of medicine, right? It is healing. It is healing the disorders of the world. But what is order and what is disorder ends up in the hands of those wielding the tools to judge. And then people is just kind of sitting there, right? It's just kind of sitting there as the object, the site of intervention. So if one accepts that there is a problem not just of definition, of limits, but a problem of editorial aspirations and the associated sort of sources of authorization and self-empowerment and so forth going on here, then one wants to step back and look at the sort of discourse of limits. And one of the things that's also been very remarkable about the response to the Chinese situation is that it was characterized as, on the one hand, sort of medically unnecessary, but also that any such project of this sort is inappropriate at this time. It is premature. So the discourse of prematurity is ubiquitous, which, we can say that tacitly implies that there's a future in which it's time. But it also tacitly implies that there's a sort of maturation, right? And that there's a process of maturation, and that we know what that process of maturation is. And so, how do we understand our relationship to the future? I like this because of the subtitle. It captures it pretty nicely. The notion that technological innovation happens, and it's a sort of a question of when the world will catch up, when the world will be ready, when the maturation of the circumstances of application are such that there won't be public backlash and there won't be, et cetera, et cetera. This is a statement by Marcia McNutt, president of National Academy of Sciences, at the release of that 2017 National Academies report, making a statement that is, of course, made all the time, that the speed at which the science is advancing outpaces society's ability to grasp its implications. But if you look at this not as a sort of observation about the speed at which things move, but rather as the sort of relationships between institutions in that third category of the human, the politics of moral imagination and judgment, you see that what's at stake here is not just a sort of description, but a kind of normative account, and indeed an authorization. So here's He in the month during the time he was under house arrest before he was imprisoned, explaining himself. If we're waiting for society to reach a consensus, it's never going to happen. But once one or a couple of scientists make the first kid, it's safe, it's healthy, then the entire society, including science, ethics, and law, will be accelerated. It will speed up, and make new rules. So there's an account of progress. The story of lag is also a story of progress. It's a story of who's behind, but also who's ahead. And the sort of authorization, at least potentially the authorization, in this case, the self-authorization to push ahead. But back of this is an idea of better, right? And an idea of making that the people are caught up in. So here's another statement about maturity that I find myself thinking a lot about as I hear people talk about the prematurity of the technology. There's a theory of progress back of this idea of immaturity and maturity. And there's a theory of progress that's back of that idea of prematurity and maturity. And, you know, those ideas of progress, of course, get materialized in the technological projects and products that are at stake in this conversation. So earlier this year, or end of last year, there was the American Society for Reproductive Medicine held its international congress. It was a sort of 40th anniversary. It was actually the 41st, but COVID screwed that up, of the first child born of IVF in the United States. And it was sort of marking that moment. And so the theme of the meeting was reproduction reimagined. And the opening remarks made by the president of the society, partly as an introduction of a talk given by Jennifer Doudna, the first in a whole series on in vitro gametogenesis, on artificial wombs, on a variety of different things. He described the sort of next 40 years and the aspirations that are guiding this society and those projects, a future in which all reproduction takes place outside of the human body, from gametogenesis to conception to whatever interventions one makes genetically at that level to gestation, the whole thing. And you know, it's pretty interesting if you step back and you ask, what human is at stake in this imagination? And you could say, well, it's the sort of designer baby, it's the humanist technological project. I think that's actually the wrong reading. I think the right reading is that this is a story, like Kant's, a story of maturation and indeed of emancipation. And that the story of emancipation that's at stake here is an emancipation of the human from the human body and from the constraints thereby imposed. And, you know, I think personally, I think that that's a profoundly dehumanizing imagination of the human. But the point I want to make is that this is a milieu in which the human is getting articulated, not merely as a sort of material site of intervention, but as a kind of agency, as a kind of moral agent who is authorized to act, and where the project of technology is undertaken in the name of achieving those conditions under which the human can kind of come to its telos, come to its fulfillment through achieving those forms of agency that is due to the human, which, you know, in a sense, the constraints of the body delimit. So this conversation, and I think one of the sort of problematizing axioms of the axiomatic problematizations of the observatory is with this the way that the technology sits at the center of these conversations, and that the notions of the sort of permissible and impermissible center of the technology. What can and should we do with this technology? Yet at stake in this are all of these sorts of tacit imaginations of, you know, of the we, of the doing, for that matter, of the technology and its disembedding, the occlusion of its embeddedness in social and political and moral orders. But what if we ask this question this way? To what purpose, to what vision of need, purpose, benefit, and good is this technology the right response? Which is, of course, human need, purpose, benefit, and good. The human is at stake, centrally at stake in that question. And it's actually not clear to me how often asking that question would lead us to genome editing. I think pretty darn rarely, actually. And yet the ways in which the human is not at stake in the first version of that question, at least not explicitly, but very profoundly, passively, is something that I think warrants quite a lot of worry.
You were going to drop the mic there. Thank you, Rachel, John, and Beth. Really stimulating talks. I'd be happy to collect questions here. We have about 18 minutes before lunch, and yes, let's start. I think I saw your hand first. Please do identify yourself.
Sure.
Testing. Hi, I'm Dan Offsprung. I'm a incoming PhD student at ASU. And my question kind of relates to both of the last two talks. One of the things that I was thinking of quite a lot during your talk, Dr. Evans, was that another reason that the disease enhancement barrier is totally untenable is that, of course, a lot of the things that are, diseases, and this is something that came up immediately in Ben's talk, a lot of the things that can be ameliorated as a disease also ameliorate some social issue, right? If we, just to have a concrete example, imagine that we take this case of a person being, having a likelihood of heart disease late in life, and the way to ameliorate that is to make them genetically far less disposed towards obesity. That's a social enhancement at the same time as it is a disease avoidance technique. Moving on to sort of Ben's three versions of the human that are at stake in this. Third one having to do with what we can do together and what people are together. The question that comes up for me is that if we did justify enhancements that are also disease cures or things like the case that I raised, to me, one of the things that's at stake there seems to be this admission of, okay, yeah, getting rid of, the social, the social perception, the negative social perception of obesity, for instance, is not a medical problem, right? It's not the job of medicine to get rid of that stigma, but allowing this sort of slippage between disease and enhancement and allowing that intervention to be made that not only cures the disease, but also performs this sort of extra enhancement socially would seem to be admitting we are not going to fix that social problem. We can only fix sort of change the individual cases. And I guess I wonder if that question of, because of the slippage of disease and enhancement, whether that question of what problems is society able to address on its own versus what problems should this be called on to address, even if they previously were looked at as social problems. How much is that at stake in these kind of decisions, and how much does that play a role in that barrier problem? And for you, John, and Ben, for you, in the question of that sort of third version of the person, or I'm sorry, of the human that you posited.
I'll start by saying that in general, I've been very skeptical of using genetic modification of the human body to solve social problems. Like you can argue that all of what's considered to be germline editing of embryos isn't actually for any disease. It's to treat the condition called people want genetically related children, which is a social condition. It's not a medical bodily condition. The one thing that gave me pause, I was on a panel once where someone said, well, how about redesigning the entire species to make us not so susceptible to global warming? Now, obviously, this is, I shouldn't use the word impossible. I said before, I don't like the word impossible. Let's say this is possible. But were it to be possible to create humanity 2.0 to keep us alive, I don't know. But in general, I am very reluctant to the idea of trying to solve social problems through genetic modification of the humans for the reasons you just described.
Yeah, so just a quick based on the climate change and human genetic modification, I'll just note that, if you tally up who wins the most points for being on the most Francois, who's on which panels multiple times, one of the people who I think wins the most points has said precisely that. Well, we need this technology because, climate change, we're going to have to adapt ourselves to the world that we've transformed. I think, that's actually a pretty nice illustration of how the boundary between biological and social should just be thrown away. I mean, let's get rid of it, please. I mean, what we should see when we encounter that boundary, it's not a sort of question of parsing which is on which side of the boundary, but a kind of boundary work that delimits sort of authority, epistemic authority, jurisdiction, this kind of problem from that kind of problem, the vector along which it's universalized versus parochialized, it's just culture, it's reality, et cetera. And I think, pick a problem. I talked about HIV in China very briefly, but let's take HIV in the United States, right? I mean, it's biosocial, right? And so I think that part of the project of this conversation is to invite ourselves to take one step back and to ask, not is this where to draw the line, but what is the significance of this line, and what are the sort of modes of signification that this line is recruiting into itself in order to be a line, in order to be intelligible as a line. To look not at the boundaries, but at the work that goes into those boundary work. And so I guess that's the response I would give. You don't, I mean, that reproduction reimagined is the sort of fulfillment of a kind of vision of liberal individualism, right? Okay, there it is. It's a political vision inscribed in the sort of materiality of the bio and vice versa.
Okay,
yeah, so Rachel talked in a really moving way about the ways in which her own standpoint had shifted when the disease came knocking at her door, in essence. So I'd like to hear back and forth between Ben, your talk about the human, and Rachel's position. I mean, so from which point of view are we looking at the human, and where does the subjective shift in Rachel's, I think, existential was one word she used, maybe philosophical or abstract. So where are you locating yourself then, and what does Rachel think of someone like you pondering the human against the trajectory of her lived life, in which what it means to be human, I think, has shifted?
Yeah, I mean, look, to me, the task is to ask better questions, and to me, the task is to ask better questions. Asking better questions means an expanded imagination and body of experience. And I mean, I guess what I would observe about the reports and so forth that were discussed this morning, important as they are, there's a kind of disembedding and a sort of sterility to them. I mean, they are not inflected with experience. Why wasn't Rachel on the International Commission? I mean, I asked someone from the National Academies that, and they said, "Oh, I think there's somebody has some background in the social sciences." But it's 80% molecular biologists. Is it about molecules, or is it about parents and children and lives lived? And so, I mean, I think the answer to that question is self-evident. So, I think that well, I mean, my hope is that in putting these sort of questions of the human on the table, we can actually have them on the table and live with them. And that means taking very seriously forms of experience that come from a life world and not from a kind of caricature of it. I think it's worth remembering that a previous iteration in this series of events, which this is part, we had someone who had a child who died of a genetic disease, say that these scientists speak to me and say, we're doing what's right and good, we're responding to disease, you don't understand it. Not knowing that she came from that experience, because she also happened to be at that time the director of the Office of Science Policy at NIH. I mean, the silencing, I think we have to see it, and we have to make room to hear and listen and inquire, not just say, well, the guy didn't comply with the bureaucratic requirements of human subjects research ethics, but ask, what was it that led dozens of people to stand up and clamor to participate in his trial, and what are the forms of neglect that create those circumstances?
Yeah, Sheila, I really appreciate your question, because I've thought about it a lot, because this is something that no one is expecting to happen, right? Nobody. I shouldn't say nobody, because it's an inherited disease. You are expecting it to happen. You probably have a different life view. For me, the answer kind of lies in the areas of alignment Because I think that if Ben and I were to sit down and make a list of 20 things, we probably have hardcore alignment around 12 of them. And then probably 8 we need to like kind of figure out. I think it's good that we're not aligned. And I think what we need to is align on our alignments. And that's where we need to kind of really dig our heels in and make progress, and then kind of navigate those tensions and see where those tensions kind of wash out depending on what the context is and kind of what the existential nature of the issue at hand is. So for me, I'm always looking for where we're finding common ground, but I don't want it to all be common ground. And that's what's allowing us to have a helpful conversation.
Take in the back, yes.
Thank you for that excellent panel. I wrote this down because I want to get it exactly right. So I'm going to read it. And it's concerning the top of John's slope. And I think Ben will probably agree with where I'm going with this, but I think his talk captured this very well, but I would like your reflection on what I'm going to ask. So the top of the slope itself, I think, is a limit, insofar as this is defined by what the culture can tolerate. I think Ben's example of what happened in China points to this. The culture didn't tolerate that, so it was deemed to be bad. So what I'm suggesting is that some things can never be at the top of that slope, whether they're disease or enhancement or good or beneficial, they can't just be, because the culture and those who have power within the culture may never tolerate them. So I'll give an example I put my students every year. If as a Black person, I say I want to have Black children and I want to use technology to achieve that, that is something I feel the culture may never tolerate. But I say, look, I don't want to be through marriage or through, I just want to have a baby who's not Black, and I want to use technology to achieve that. How might the culture respond to that? And so, in a way, limits are natural to the process of how we think about these things. And I think I told us so, regardless of whether it shares similarity in vagueness or not, some things are just not going to be at the top by default. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on what I have provocatively suggested. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of things that wouldn't even be considered part of the slope, something you could, people would say you could never ever do. So I think that's definitely the case. I mean, and moreover, when you talk about the views of people in power, the question is, where do these values that I'm holding, where do those come from? And the answer is not through some sort of public consultation process we keep talking about, but it's essentially through representations of culture as described by people with power, and so that's definitely the case. The debate I'm describing is I should have constrained it in various ways. I'm definitely only talking about the United States, maybe the Anglophone world, but the United States in particular, but really constrained essentially the types of people who would show up before a government commission testifying on this. And those are the ones I identified as the possible barriers. There's also other ones that people have identified, but people with influence don't consider them serious, and so they aren't going to get a hearing. So your general point is well taken.
We'll collect questions. Lead into lunch just a few minutes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say at the beginning, I really appreciated your comment, Rachel, about how much time I've spent on the question relative to the answer. And I put that in the context of, I often think that, or I buy into the belief that he, and it often is a he who controls the question ultimately controls the answer. And so I'm sympathetic then to you almost at the very end, a bit of a reprise by putting up two versions of the question that are very different. And the first one being, what should we do with this technology, which I put under the banner, this is really cool science, what can I do with it? And people running around thinking that that's the starting point. But I want to offer sort of a little bit of a challenge to your effort to reframe that. And so you reframed it as saying, to what vision of human need, purpose, benefit, and good is this technology the right response? And while I'm sympathetic to the effort to reorient, I'm taking it to be purposeful that you put human into that phrase. And the thing I worry about is in the context of genome editing, a lot of the modifications being done right now that are not yet on humans, but are on plant life, animal life, et cetera, they're all being done through a narrow frame of reference, which is the human, right? So we're going to modify this cat so it's hyperallergenic to fit the human. We're going to modify this mosquito so that we don't get malaria. We're going to modify this cow so it will survive in climate change so that we can continue to eat meat. And so I'm actually quite worried about where we are even inserting the human in the context of this technology. So just a friendly challenge.
I mean, I guess I would say I agree. I mean, of course, it's there in all of those projects of technological transformation that are that are undertaken by the human and in the name of the human, and but often sort of thoughtlessly. I mean, one of the things that, just to come back to that, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, I think that the enthusiastic audience hearing, you know, all reproduction takes place outside of the human body is thinking it's not the same thing that, you know, Nick Bostrom would be thinking or something like that. It's not some hubristic vision of the technologized human. It's that, whoa, this is really going to expand our market. And, you know, I mean, it's the ways in which the problems are constructed, the people for whom those problem framings and associated solutions are, you know, to whom they're oriented. I don't know. I mean, these seem to me things that are just fundamental that one always has to attend to. And yet, if we ask, you know, what should we do with this technology, we're basically asking the limits question: are there any limits? If so, what are the limits? And, you know, then some frame of human need, purpose, whatever else I put in that list is just imported and taken for granted and not made itself a direct object of deliberation.
Can I just add just a little footnote to that, which is that the extent to which the public's views of things will determine what happens. Empirical studies of the public's views of humans and animals show that most of the public believes in essentially the great chain of being up until humans, and then there's a huge hinge. And so almost everyone in the public believes in human exceptionalism, not that you shouldn't treat animals nicely, et cetera, et cetera. But there's definitely very much a foundational divide in East American views of this sort of thing.
Sheila, you want to say something?
Well, tiny follow-up, maybe Francois will correct me, but what I heard there was not only the human-centric, that is the human as the point of reference, but also the instrumentalization point. I mean, it is the human purpose that is shaping the world, but then everything else we do with the technology is to further those human purposes still further, which I think is a different point from just taking the human as the measure of all things.
So I will collect, let's say, I three questions. Let's do short questions and then we'll go.
Hi, my name is Derek Saha. I'm a visiting scholar originally from McGill, and I have another question for Professor Evans. When you talk about the role of things like continuity vagueness or similarity vagueness in sociological barriers, you make a really strong case for cognitive sociology, as well as in your other books that I'm a really big fan of. So I was wondering if you could comment on what research or involvements you think people from psychology or cognitive science who have been very much involved in the genome editing debate so far can contribute to sort of the cosmopolitan vision of ethics and governance that the Observatory is forwarding.
I'm glad you're reflecting. That was a good chance.
Yeah, so I just wanted to come back to Rachel's point about advocacy and maybe ask a question about Professor Evans, you had made the point about the conceptual, I guess, slippages that can take place, but it seems one question that raises is what the slippery slope is actually framed in terms of who's advocacy politics. So I mean, from the conservative point of view, it might be a slippery slope, but maybe from a progressive view, you'd see the slope as a kind of slope toward progress. And maybe for Ben, that's a question about the slide you had about reproduction taking place outside of the body. So if it is outside of the body, I mean, that's progressive from some point of view. I mean, it gives people certain autonomy and choice and certain ways in which that fits into advocacy positions. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit.
Is there one more hand? Right. Okay, so 2 questions. Seems like John, you'll start.
Yeah, I want to back out the first one, which is, yeah, I agree totally. I cut it in the name of time, but when I talk about this other time to say, there's some people who think that this slope isn't pointing down, it's pointing up. It's a struggle. So transhumanists would say, how fast can I get to this point at the end? Like, you know, Gattaca is utopia, right? So this is sort of told from the sort of, I think, the more dominant perspective, which is the sort of slope down. But absolutely, there's a normative perspective, which is like that's what is should to be achieved. And these aren't barriers, they're handholds, you know. But I'm sort of defining, I think, what is the dominant perspective in these debates. And then the call out to social science, the other things that I've written in the past have been accused of being like the Sociology Full Employment Act of 2020, where I call for sociologists to create these schemes and everything. And so this will be the sort of cognitive sociology, cognitive science, social psychology Full Employment Act of 2022, which is that opposite what I'm describing, sort of differences is essentially absolute central to the domain theory, other theories of cognition, where people say endlessly, like when you look at a bunch of animals, why is it that wings is a demarcator of them besides the color? No, color doesn't make demarcations, but wings does, or feet, or whatever. And so this is obviously, if you wanted to get the detail of this, is a massive cognitive sociology problem. And so, I think if someone really got into the weeds of how you would design something, you'd want to talk to people who actually understood the differences there truly are in the human mind. I'm kind of extrapolating from what I know about policy, but I've never actually gotten into the details. But I can kind of imagine how you would design a study to do it if you have $60,000 to spend.
All right. On that note, I think we'll continue the discussions over lunch and let's thank our panelists.